Hello and welcome. In today's lesson, we're going to be looking at 5 tips to help you in part 1 of the IELTS speaking test. So, tip number 1 is to prepare the common topics. Now, you never really know what you're going to get asked about in the IELTS speaking test. However, you are guaranteed to be asked one of 5 topics: your home, your hometown, your neighborhood, your studies, or if you work, your job. So to feel more confident and to do your best in the IELTS speaking test, try and learn some useful vocabulary and phrases for these common topics before you do your test. Okay, so when it comes to describing your home, well, here's some vocabulary that I've heard in previous practice tests with my students that I've noticed as being high-level vocabulary. Things like cozy. So a student once told me, I live in a cozy apartment. So cozy is when your apartment or your house is typically small and nice and warm. So a cozy apartment. You could say that it is neat and tidy, which is an idiom that means that it's clean and well organized. You could live in a modern house or a modern flat or a modern apartment. You could be in a spacious house, which means that it's large and with a lot of area to move around in. Another student described their apartment as being light, which means that there's lots of natural light that comes in during the day, a bit like this apartment. And here's another phrase I heard the other day that I really liked. A student told me, I live in a typical Chinese apartment. Okay, so they were from Shanghai and they said, I live in a typical Chinese apartment. And then the good thing is, they elaborated on what a typical Chinese apartment is. Okay. And another phrase that they used that I really liked was this. They said it's very cramped, which means when there's not a lot of space and there's a lot of things in a very small amount of space, so you feel cramped. Okay, here's some useful phrases and things to consider when you're describing your home. You could say, it has great views overlooking. So maybe you live in the countryside and you have great views overlooking the mountains. I doubt that, but it's possible. You could say, what I like best is the kitchen, and then go on to explain why you like the kitchen so much. One thing I don't like is, so one thing I don't like about my apartment is the fact that it's kind of on the outskirts and it's hard to get to the city centre. I've been living here for or since. So I've been living here for 2 years. I've been living here since 2019. So we say for when we describe a duration of time and since to describe a moment in time when something happened. So I've been living here since 2019. Okay, and examiners are listening out for complex grammar, things like I've been living here since, because that's the present perfect continuous. So if you were describing your apartment or your house, what would you say? Would you say, I've been living here for 2 years, or I've been living here since I was born? Okay, next, describing your hometown. So your hometown is typically the town or the city where you were born, and we can describe it as being dynamic. So maybe you live in a dynamic city like Shanghai, where everything is changing and there's a lot of movement. You could say that it's bustling, which means it's very busy, lots of people moving very quickly in the city. Vibrant, which means that there's a lot of energy and it feels very alive. Likewise, you could say lively, it's a very lively city I live in. Touristy, so maybe you live in a city like Paris or Barcelona, where lots of tourists come to visit regularly. Another nice phrase, I live in a densely populated city or a densely populated neighborhood. So densely populated is the same as cramped. It's when there's a lot of people in a small space. You could say it's densely populated. Peaceful. So when it's very calm, a very peaceful city. And picturesque. So we would use this if we're describing an area that we live in that's very beautiful. For example, I live in a picturesque town in the mountains. All right, here's some phrases that we can use. One thing I like is, so one thing you like about your hometown. My city is famous for example, the city that I'm living in now is famous for Guinness. I wonder if you know which city I'm living in. I've been living here for or since, so I've been living here for 2 years. One thing I would love to change is, okay, so sometimes you're asked about what you would change about your hometown or your home or your neighborhood. So it's typically quite a difficult question to answer on the spot. So think about that now before you go into your speaking test. What is one thing that you would like to change about your home, your hometown, your neighborhood? Right, next we have your neighborhood. So you could say that you live in a quiet neighborhood, a quaint neighborhood, which means it's old-fashioned and small. An old-fashioned neighborhood, a residential neighborhood, so that's when you live in an area where lots of other people live and there's not so many shops around. A noisy neighborhood, a busy neighborhood. I live in a neighborhood close to the city center or close to lots of amenities. And amenities are things like shopping centers, transport links, offices, things that are useful and typically in a city. You could say that your neighborhood is conveniently located. Okay, now here's some phrases that you can use. It's full of, so it's full of shops and restaurants. It suits me because, so if you say something suits me, you're saying that you like it. So I could say, my neighborhood suits me because it's so relaxing and tranquil, and I really like living in that kind of neighborhood. We could say, I wish it were or I wish it had. So if you live in a tranquil neighborhood, maybe you wish it had a little bit more nightlife, or I wish it had more shops or things to do. One thing that gets on my nerves is, so if something gets on your nerves, it means that it annoys you. So for example, one thing that gets on my nerves is sometimes our neighbors sing karaoke late into the night. So that's one thing that gets on my nerves. So think about what's one thing that gets on your nerves about your neighborhood. Also maybe about your hometown, your home. Okay, next, your studies. So if you are a student, it's possible that you'll be asked about your studies. Now, you could be asked about your classes, you could be asked about your teachers, your peers, which are the other students that you study with, and you could be asked about your university or college or high school, if you're still at high school. So think about how you would describe all of these things, and then look for some vocabulary that you can use when you're describing these things. So if we're describing our studies, we could say that, well, my classes are very enlightening, which means that you find them very interesting and you're learning a lot. You could say that they're fascinating, which is similar. It means that you're very interested in what you're studying. You could say that the classes are dynamic, which means that they're constantly changing and there's a lot of variety in the activities you do. You could say that they are motivational, or your teacher is motivational because they motivate you to learn and spend time learning. You might have an enthusiastic teacher, so someone that's very exciting and really enjoys teaching and motivating the students. You could also have a demanding class, so a class that requires you to do a lot of homework or spend a lot of time revising. Maybe your teacher is supportive, so they really help you to do your best, and maybe they stay longer even after the class finishes just to help the students understand certain concepts. And here's a word that I really like, it's monotonous. So if something is monotonous, it's very repetitive and unchanging. So you could say, well, my classes are rather monotonous. They're just lectures and they're quite similar, repetitive, they're monotonous. Okay, so what about our job? Well, you might have to describe your manager, your place of work, your colleagues, or the industry that you work in. So here's some phrases and vocabulary that you can use. Your job might be rewarding, so you get a sense of fulfillment from your job. Fulfilling, your job can be fulfilling. People often say the job of a teacher is very fulfilling because you get to see your students progress. You might have a creative job, like being a designer or an editor or an artist. A well-paid job. Hopefully one or two of you out there are in well-paid jobs. Again, monotonous. So not a good thing if you describe your job as monotonous. It means that it's very repetitive and you do the same thing over and over again. You might have a stressful job. It's very common these days. A demanding job. Maybe you have to work late or work into the weekends. And then finally, you might have a poorly paid job. Okay, so here's a little challenge for you. How would you describe your home, your hometown, your neighborhood, your studies, and if you work, your job? Write it in your first language, so in your native language, and then try and translate it into English and see which vocabulary you don't know. So which vocabulary you need to translate your description of your home, your hometown, your neighborhood, your studies, your job into English. And by looking up those words, you're going to be more prepared for your IELTS speaking test. Okay, the second tip is to use linking words. Now, here's some useful linking words. Instead of always saying, I think, we can say things like, I reckon. So I think and I reckon are synonyms. We could say, I'd say. So I'd say is I would say. And we often use it instead of saying, I think, especially in Ireland. You could say, I guess. So especially if you're giving an opinion about something that you're not totally sure about, you could say, I guess most people enjoy traveling abroad, but there are some people that enjoy staying at home. So I guess instead of I think. We can also use linking words for and, things like also, I'd also say, plus. So these are useful phrases for expanding on your ideas and giving more ideas. Okay, we also have some linking words for introducing a contrast, things like but, however, saying that, mind you. For example, you could say, well, there are lots of benefits of studying abroad. For example, you get to learn another language, you get to meet people from all over the world. Mind you, it is rather expensive. So do you see the way mind you can be used to introduce a contrasting idea? Now, examiners are listening out for these kind of linking words that you use to organize your ideas. So practice using these linking words before you go to do your speaking test. Okay, next we also have some linking words for example. Now, a really good way of expanding and elaborating on your ideas is to give examples in your speaking and also your writing as well. So you can say, for example, for instance, such as, or like. These are great ways to introduce examples in your speaking. Okay, we also have useful connectors and linking words for when you get asked some of those tricky questions that you're not quite sure about. Here's one of my personal favorites. I've never really considered that, I guess. And then the important thing is that you attempt to answer the question. And phrases like this are very useful because a lot of the time in IELTS you'll get asked questions that you've never really considered before and are quite frankly quite odd. So if you do get asked an odd question or a question that you've never really thought about, don't just say, I don't know, sorry. Say something like, I've never really considered that, but I guess, and then attempt your answer. Okay, you could also say, I don't know if I'm the right person to ask, but I'd say, and then your answer. So a student of mine recently used this in our practice speaking test, and I really liked it. So I asked her, what tips would you give to somebody for using technology less in their day-to-day life? And they said, I don't really know if I'm the right person to ask, but I'd say to them, and then they gave them some tips. So that's a very nice linking word, and hearing that linking word meant that they got a higher score for fluency and coherence. Okay, another one. Tricky question. I'd say, and then you give your answer. So I'd say is I would say. Remember we looked at that earlier when we saw synonyms for I think. So I'd say, I would say. Right, interesting question. I reckon, okay, right, interesting question. I reckon, and then you give your answer. Now with all of these, you wouldn't necessarily want to use them artificially. So if you get a question like, where do you live? You're not going to say, I've never really considered that. I guess I live in Nepal. So only really use these when you're genuinely unsure about how to answer, or when you need a second to think about the answer. So this is typically when you get asked a question about your opinions, not necessarily about your life. So these are very useful for part 3 of the speaking test, but you also get asked about your opinions in part 1. So these are some useful phrases that you can use when you need to give yourself a little moment to think before you answer. Okay, tip number 3. Elaborate on your answers. Don't just give short answers. Now, I've got a method called the REE method, and that is respond, elaborate, and give an example. And I'll show you what I mean. Imagine you get a question like this. Do you think children should wear school uniforms? You could say, yes, I do. So you respond, and typically your response is quite short, but don't just stop there. Afterwards, elaborate or extend your answer. Say something like this. If all the students had to wear a uniform, then there will be less discrimination based on the type of clothing that they wear. Okay, so they've extended their answer, they've elaborated on their answer, and then finally, the final E is example. So give an example. For example, in my school, we didn't have a school uniform, and certain students were picked on because of the clothes they wore to school. It sounds crazy, but kids can be cruel like that. Okay, so the REE method. Respond, elaborate, example. Right, number 4. Use idiomatic language. Okay, so idiomatic language is idioms and phrasal verbs, typically. Let's have a look at some idioms. So imagine you're describing your best friend. So here's some idioms that you could use. You could say they are a people person. So if they're a sociable person that enjoys spending time with different people, you could say they are a people person. You could say that they are laid back. So laid back means that they're relaxed. They're a lone wolf. So if you have a best friend that's very independent and likes to spend time primarily by themselves when they're not with you, then they are a lone wolf. You could say that they're a troublemaker. They like to cause trouble. Maybe they're slightly mischievous or rebellious. Hopefully you have a best friend that is open-minded, so is willing to take in ideas from all over the world and not very strict about the things they believe. Now when you use idioms like these, don't just say, oh, my best friend is a people person. They're very laid back. They're such a lone, well, actually you're never going to be a people person and a lone wolf. But don't say something like, oh, they're a people person. They're very laid back, although sometimes they are a troublemaker. If you use that kind of, that attempt to kind of show off certain vocabulary, the examiner might think that you've just memorized these words and that you don't fully understand them. So instead, use the REE method. So If I were describing my best friend, I'd say, oh, well, they're a real people person. So that's me responding to the question, and then I would elaborate. I would say, they're always going to parties, and they're always super excited when they get to meet new people. And then I'd go for the next E, where I give an example. For example, last week we went to a party, and even though we're best friends, I didn't get to speak to him for a single second because he was out meeting people the entire time. So the REE method is a very useful way to make sure that you're fully answering all of the questions. Okay, so we said that idioms are idiomatic, and so are phrasal verbs. So again, if I'm describing my best friend, I could say things like, well, we meet up at the weekend. So meet up is a phrasal verb. It's when we have a verb and a particle, meet up. I could say, we usually hang out at his place. So hang out is a phrasal verb. And examiners are listening out for idioms and phrasal verbs to see whether you can use idiomatic language, which is part of getting a high score for lexical resource. We like to work out at the gym. So work out is a phrasal verb that means do exercise. He likes to keep up with the latest fashion trends. So keep up with the latest fashion trends means that he's a fashionable person and likes to pay attention to what's fashionable and not so fashionable. Okay, the final tip is to listen carefully to the question. Now, this is particularly important with two certain question types, and the first one is when you hear would in the question. Look at this. Would you ever spend a lot of money on clothes designed by a famous designer? Now, often when I ask a question like this, the student will say, no, I don't. And then I know that they're not fully listening to the question, because I'm not saying, do you ever spend a lot of money on clothes designed by a famous designer? I'm saying, would you ever spend a lot of money on clothes designed by a famous designer? So there's a slight difference there. When I use would, I'm asking a hypothetical question. So would you in the future, or would you, if you were rich, spend money on clothes designed by a famous designer? Okay, so listen out for those woulds. It often means that you're being asked a hypothetical question. This is also important for part 2, but we'll get on that in another video. The next question that causes a lot of trouble for students is this. Why do you think some people spend a lot of money on jewellery? So often I'll ask this kind of question, and a lower level student might say, I don't spend a lot of money on jewellery. But the question is slightly more complex. It's, why do you think some people spend a lot of money on jewellery? So I'm not asking about you, but I'm asking about your opinions about other people. So this is an important consideration and something to look out for in the speaking test. Okay, now if you're not sure what the examiner has asked you, you can always say something like, sorry, could you repeat the question? Or, sorry, what does that mean? So if you're unsure about a particular word, you can always ask them to give you a definition for that word. Just say something like, sorry, what does mean? Okay, now the last thing that we're going to do is some do's and don'ts for the IELTS speaking test. So do, speak clearly and make eye contact. Sometimes I'll do practice speaking tests with students that feel very nervous, and typically what they'll do is this. They start to look down and they begin to talk into their chest, and it makes it very difficult to understand what they're saying. Instead, try and make eye contact with the examiner and speak directly at them. It's very often that the examiner will be writing notes while you're speaking, and so don't worry about that. Just keep looking in their direction and speaking to them as though they're looking at you. Some examiners also won't make a huge amount of eye contact, but as long as you're looking directly at them, speaking, then that's the best that you can do. Next thing is to be polite. It's just useful to be polite, and you'll create a good impression for the examiner. We looked at this earlier, but do elaborate on your answers. Don't just give one-word answers in part 1 of the speaking test. If you do that, you're likely to get band 5 because you're not showing the examiner that you can speak at length, which is something they're looking for to give you a band 6, 7 or above. Use language you are familiar with. So if you've just learned a new word and you think you know how to use it, but you're not 100% sure, then don't use it in your speaking test. It's better to use language that you're comfortable with and you're familiar with so that you can use it in the appropriate context in your speaking test. Another tip is to watch videos of real IELTS tests. Now there's a load of them on YouTube, and just by watching particularly high-level candidates and high-level students, you'll get a good idea of what the examiner is looking for and familiarize yourself with the kind of atmosphere and the kind of questions you'll get asked in the speaking test. Now, as for the don'ts, don't answer "I don't know." Or you can always say "I don't know," but then do give an answer anyway. Don't just say "I don't know, sorry," and then wait for the next question. It's better to give an answer even if you're not 100% sure. Remember, there are no right or wrong answers. The examiner just wants to hear your opinion. Also, don't spend too long considering your answer. If I asked you a question like, what do you like best about your hometown? I don't really care if it's genuinely 100% the thing you like best. So I don't need you to go, what do I like best about my hometown? What do I like best about my hometown? So instead of doing that, just say, well, I guess there's a few things I like about my hometown. I like the fact that it's a dynamic city. I like the fact that the public transport system is very efficient. I like the fact that the people here are very friendly. So you can start to list off ideas, and usually as you list them off, one of them will strike you as being your favorite, and you can say, actually, come to think of it, I think my favorite thing about my hometown is the people that you find here. Okay. The next thing you shouldn't do is to ask the examiner questions. It's not really a conversation in that way. The examiner asks and you answer. Okay, and finally, don't memorize your answers. It's a good idea to learn vocabulary for common topics, but don't go about trying to memorize answers for every part of the speaking test, because you'll just make your life more difficult. Just focus on becoming more fluent and confident in English, and that'll do you a lot better in the speaking test. And finally, don't worry if the examiner interrupts you. Remember, they've got a lot of questions they need to ask you in quite a short period of time, and so it's quite typical that the examiner will interrupt you so that they can get through all of their questions before the end of the test. Okay, I hope that's been useful, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson. Bye then.